Welcome back to the Historical Imagination, and today we're going to talk a little bit about myth and history. How does myth inform our understanding of history, and can mythology be a reliable guide of any kind in our historical studies? Can it reveal information that is accurate as well as yielding universal truths or ideas that are accurate? That is often the role of myth, to provide story that may not be historically based, but story which conveys universal truths in creative ways. But can those same myths, which are often couched in fantastic ways, often incorporating elements that are not realistic, can they still be windows to teach us something about the actual events and circumstances of ancient periods? One model we're going to look at today for addressing this question concerns the peoples of the region that we come eventually to know as Greece. Early in its history, it was known as Hellas, and in fact, it was known as Hellas by the people who inhabited it for most of their history. Ironically, the Greeks, because of the work of Herodotus, end up naming everyone else's stuff, because Herodotus goes and he supposedly travels, at least he claims to far-flung parts of the ancient world, and he ends up naming Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. He names Egyptian hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are holy writing because he sees those symbols, or is reported to have discovered that those symbols were placed on temples. So therefore, he assumed they were some kind of holy writing, hieroglyphics. Well, the irony is the people who named so many other things in the ancient world, they themselves end up being named by the Romans. The Romans are going to call the area Magna Graecae, and the people who lived in that area are going to be known to history as the Greeks. We're going to look at two of the earliest Greek societies, although you would have to put at least one of those societies as Greek in air quotes, like not actually Greek, but sort of Proto-Greek, you might say. That first civilization probably arose around 2000 BC or BCE, and it arose centered around the island of Crete, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen on the map below. Crete was an area that's a little bit isolated from the other islands right off the coast of the mainlands of what will become Asia Minor and what will become the Greek Peninsula. And it's here that one of the earliest civilizations in the area was planted. This civilization has come to be known as the Minoan civilization, and that at the very outset is an indicator of the fact that mythology and history intertwine quite a bit in our study of this area. Minos was a fabled king of the island who was said in Greek mythology to have been given a beautiful white bull, the bull of Minos, by the gods. Minos' wife, however, became enamored with the bull. Hijinks ensued, and the result is that Minos' wife gave birth to a half-bull, half-human creature called the Minotaur, the actual bull of Minos, the one definitely that caused the biggest headaches. This legend goes on to state that Greek peoples from the mainland were subservient to the Minoans and had to send young people as tribute to be devoured by the Minotaur. And one of the most exciting and interesting of Greek stories, the young prince of Athens goes, his name is Theseus, he goes amongst the group of young people given as tribute because he intends to overturn this system of tribute. He ultimately does that by using a ball of thread and some help from Minos' daughter to get into the labyrinth, which is where the bull of Minos, the Minotaur, had been hidden away. He navigates this labyrinth using spool of thread. He ultimately finds the Minotaur and kills him, and then he departs. He escapes using this locator beacon, this primitive locator beacon that he's created, and he ends up returning with the young people of Athens. Sad coda to the story, though, you know, it's a Greek tragedy for a reason. Greek tragedies are called Greek tragedies for a reason. He was supposed to change the sail from a black sail to a white sail to announce to his father that he had survived. But, you know, they're young people, they're partying, and they ultimately end up forgetting to change the sail. And so Theseus's father, whose name is Aegeus, looks across the ocean, sees the boat returning with the young people, realizes the sail has not changed, and plunges into the waters below. He throws himself off into the water. and commits suicide. So Theseus returns home to find that he has become king due to the suicide of his father because he believed that his son had died at the hands of the Minotaur. But, consolation prize, the sea is called the Aegean Sea, and according to the Greek legend, it's called the Aegean Sea because Aegeus plunged into its depths and was no more. Well, all of these legends were taught to generations of people, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries AD or CE, during the neoclassical period. Many of the founding fathers of the United States grew up with stories of ancient Carthaginian and Roman generals and Greek mythology, and so did the peoples of the 19th century as well. A number of young archaeologists that began excavations at the very end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, carried with them their love for these Greek myths. The archaeologists who uncovered the settlement on Crete, which came to be called the Minoan civilization, were very big fans of these Greek myths. And so as they uncovered artifacts, they associated them with the mythology. And in fact, it's kind of interesting. There are some things that do resonate with the ancient myths. For instance, they found this vast temple complex at a place they called Knossos, which was filled with all kinds of interesting aspects, including a sort of basement area, an underground area, that may have been some sort of storehouse, which very much resembled a labyrinth. It was very confusing, a very hard place to navigate, and one could say that it was akin to the labyrinth of ancient mythology. They found, as they were exploring, different samples of writing which came to be called Linear A. Unfortunately, even down to the present day, we cannot translate Linear A. It is something that is beyond our abilities. We've not yet cracked the code to translate it. The best we can tell is that it is a Semitic language, which differentiates these people from the people who are going to come in to the mainland. Those people seem to have spoken an Indo-European dialect. And so it seems that these Minoan peoples probably came from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean because their dialect is somewhat different. But beyond that, that's all we can tell about their language because we can't translate it. Well, all the stories about the Minotaur, they never found the skeleton of any kind of bull of Minos, but they did find the inscription that you see behind me of some people wearing a headdress that looked like the head of a bull and some kind of unusual custom or depiction of someone pole vaulting over the back of what looks like a bovine creature. It's led to all kinds of speculation about how the legend of the Minotaur might have begun in the religious rites of the people who inhabited the island of Crete. Possibly the people who lived in this civilization we now call Minoan civilization worshipped a deity that had the body of a human and the head of a bull, and this gets translated into the ancient Greek mythology of the Minotaur, the bull of Minos. Another curious thing about this civilization is its end. It just ends pretty abruptly, and it looks like there was quite a bit of chaos that ensued in its latter years. We know that the peoples of the mainland were subservient to these Minoans for a while, and that they did indeed send tribute, as the legends suggest, because we have some artifacts from the mainland that are stored in the settlements that are on Crete. And so therefore we do know that there is some trade going on and possibly some tribute being paid by these people to the peoples of Crete as well, by the peoples of the mainland to the peoples of Crete. It seems like, or it appears, that sometime between 628 and 1450, and we're somewhat squirrely on the dates because it's hard to tell exactly when, but sometime circa that time frame, there appears to be some sort of natural disaster that overtook the island. One theory has been that the disaster took place because of an earthquake, a tremor that happened on the island of Thera. At least it was known as Thera back then. Today the island is known as Santorini, and it's off the coast of the Greek mainland. Santorini is a great vacation spot. It's a very lovely area, but it also features a very interesting curiosity. There is a crescent-shaped depression at the edge of the island where a seismic event during the ancient period literally tore loose some of the ground and caused it to collapse into the ocean. There are many historians who theorize that this seismic event and possibly the tidal wave it produced may have been what destroyed some of the settlements on the northern coast of Crete. It would make sense because Thera, Santorini today, is lined up perfectly so that whatever events happened there would sweep southward and possibly impact the island of Crete. This may well have given rise to yet another myth. That myth is the myth of Atlantis, which is later repeated by a number of Greek scholars, most prominent among them the Greek philosopher Plato. This is the story of a legendary kingdom that ascended to the depths of the ocean and somehow continued to survive and thrive in the depths of the ocean. Jason Momoa's home now as Aquaman. This may well be the root of those ancient legends and myths that get passed down about Atlantis, the lost city, which is embedded on the bottom of the ocean. This is an artist rendering of Knossos, the palace complex, which was the biggest area of settlement on the island of Crete, and may well have covered the real labyrinth. The peoples who occupied the mainland come to be known by us as Mycenaeans. And this is because one of the major city-states they founded was known as Mycenae. We believe that they entered the Greek peninsula probably from the Balkans, sometime circa 1900, 1800 or so. We know that they are an Indo-European people group, and we know this because we have cracked the key to translate their language. Their language is called Linear B. For a long time, we were challenged to translate it, but then scholars began to realize that Linear B is basically an early form of Greek. They had decided that it was some other language because the symbols are different, but as they began to work with it, they started to realize that in fact, Linear B is simply Greek language without Phoenician characters. It is Greek language before that time when the Greeks adopted the phonetic style of alphabet pioneered by the Phoenicians, and as a result, began to limit the number of characters they used in their language. The Phoenicians had only used 22. The Greeks are only going to use 24 in their language. And so essentially, Linear B is Proto-Greek language. It's Greek language without the transformation of the Phoenician phonetic alphabet that's going to come later, just after the Greek Dark Ages around 800 BC or BCE. So we can read Linear B, unlike Linear A. So if you plan to get famous and rich, then you should probably be studying Linear A and trying to figure out how to read that. And when you do, just send the checks to me for giving you the idea to, my local address, and I'll be glad to deposit all of those while you're going around giving interviews on CNN or whatever other news channel you prefer. The peoples of the mainland, as we've already said, do seem to have been subordinated to the Minoans for a while and to have paid tribute to them. But that doesn't last forever. And in fact, it begins to fall apart by about 1700 to about 1650. There was trade and commerce going on. There may well have been tribute flowing back and forth as well. But once the Minoan civilization begins to decline after 1650 or so, at that point, the Mycenaeans begin to rise and become more powerful. Now, who they are and what they did are very hard to discern because our sources are limited. And in fact, the sources we have about this period primarily come from archaeology and also from the two great epics that were written by someone under the name Homer in the 8th century BCE. And as you could probably see, as you probably already have guessed, the problem with those documents is that they are made much later. They were written down much later than the actual historical events. They're based on oral traditions that probably were handed down for centuries before. And so there's a real question how much historical truth is conveyed in those tales. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two great Greek epics produced by Homer, Homer tells the story of the Trojan War, which he claims lasted for about 10 years. The people of the Greek peninsula, the Mycenaeans, were engaged in combat with the peoples of an area known as Ilium, hence the name Iliad. Later on in Latin, it's going to be called Troy. They went across the Aegean and went to war with the peoples of Ilium, and it resulted in this titanic war of a war of wars, a war of heroes, a war of legends, a war in which people like Hector and Priam and Paris are engaged in the side of the Trojans, while people like Achilles, Agamemnon, and others are engaged on the side of the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans ultimately are going to triumph in this conflict, although it's going to be very costly for them. The sequel, the Odyssey, is all about how one hero on the Greek side of the Trojan War, Odysseus, makes his way back home. He undergoes quite a bit of struggle in order to return home and reclaim both his kingship and his wife as well from a number of suitors who would like to have both. The Iliad actually purports to be the story of about 50 days at the end of that conflict. And rather than focusing on the war itself, it focuses primarily on the, quote, wrath of Achilles, in which Achilles gets angry with Agamemnon, who is said to be the leader of the expedition, because Agamemnon takes from him Briseis, a young woman that he captured in battle and feels entitled to because she is his spoil of war. Agamemnon takes her away, and Achilles, in retaliation, refuses to fight for the Greeks any longer, which leads to a number of disasters. The beginning of the epic states, "Sing, O Muse, of the wrath of Achilles, the son of Peleus, and the tragedy that it brought to the Greeks." And as the story unfolds, it's primarily the story of how Achilles comes to regret his decision, how he comes to pursue vengeance against Hector, and how achieving that vengeance ends up breaking him in many ways, causing him to come to a new realization about who he is and about his gifts for warfare and how they should be employed and how they shouldn't be employed. So it's a very fascinating story, and like so many Greek tragedies, just infused with pathos. And one of the most amazing things about it is the Iliad really makes you connect with the Trojans just as much as you connect with the Greeks. It is the sort of story that gives you sort of a universal sense of the enormity of this tragedy and how no one who's engaged in it is going to come out unscathed. All are going to suffer. All are going to struggle. So what do we get from these epics? Well, we do get the sense that these are separate city-states who are contending. They're united by certain tribal leaders, but ultimately they exist as scattered city-states. We do know archaeologically that was the status of the early settlements on the Greek peninsula before the beginning of the Greek Dark Ages in 1100. So that is established both by the history and by the epics as well. We also discovered at the end of the 19th century, thanks to a German adventurer named Heinrich Schliemann, that Ilium was a real place. There actually was a city there on the Bosphorus Strait, on the edge of the Aegean Sea, right where one would think it would be based on what the epic said. Schliemann very clumsily dug down, making future archaeologists extremely sad because of how messy his excavations were. He slammed down through the layers and was not very efficient at dating those layers and keeping a good chronology of the various Troys or Iliums that he was descending down through. But in the end, his work did demonstrate that, in fact, there was a grain of historical truth here. Now, unlike in the epics, we don't think the Greeks went across the sea to get Helen back, and Helen, who had been queen of Sparta and becomes known in history as Helen of Troy. We don't think they were actually going to get her back, as the epic states, but we do think probably there was some kind of conflict, maybe over trade, that emerged between the peoples of Ilium and the Greeks of the Greek mainland and ended in this very tragic conflict between the two people groups. There is evidence as you plow down through the layers of damage done to Troy during the Bronze and Iron Age periods. And so there may well be something to this. The Trojan War, which is at one time thought to be absolute legend, may in fact be based on a grain of historical reality. As we look at fiction, as we look at myth, we always have to be mindful that mythology is first and foremost designed in order to teach more universal truths, sometimes metaphysical truths like religious truths, or at least truths about the nature of human existence in the world. And that was the intended purpose of myth. And so ancient peoples were not nearly as concerned about factual or historical accuracy as we are. That is very much our inheritance from the Enlightenment period. So you do have to bear that in mind and know that most mythologies from the ancient world, even those that were eventually set down in writing after they've been transmitted for an indeterminate time as oral histories, even those that are written down in documents, they often contain layers of unreality, layers of untruth, if you're talking about bare, raw historical accuracy. So we always have to be very careful of that. At the same time, these stories are enchanting, they're inspiring, they become windows that make us curious about what the historical reality was and get us keep searching for that. And sometimes they can reveal factual details just by the context they draw. The whole idea of the labyrinth may well have been based on that actual storehouse beneath the palace at Knossos. The idea of the Trojan War, though the cause of the war, possibly the persons involved in it, and the way it played out was fictionalized in the writings of Homer or the Homers, depending on whether it was a single person or a whole school of authors that compiled those two epics. Either way, there seems to have been a grain of historical truth there. Sometimes you do have to be careful about setting, because both in terms of the setting and the tools that are employed by the troops in the Iliad and the Odyssey, sometimes you don't know if you're seeing references to the actual potential historical time period at the end of the 1200s, or if you're seeing references that are more akin to Homer's time, when they are actually crafting the stories and possibly referring to the methods of warfare, the technology and tools of their own period, and casting that back. That's what historians call an anachronism, something that does not belong in a period being cast back into that story by a later generation. So certainly you do have to be careful, but elements like that, elements like setting, elements like customs that are incorporated into the stories, these can often tell us a lot about the cultures that these stories were produced in, the cultures that produce these stories, and lead us to some very hard and very helpful information about the actual historical circumstances of these peoples. I once read a book, a novel, by John Grisham, where his main character touched down in Memphis, Tennessee, and then drove to the outskirts of the city. And Grisham was very descriptive. He talked about each phase of this person's trip through town, and I recognized what he was talking about because my parents live in Memphis, and I am able, when I go there, to see these neighborhoods unfold as I drive through the town. He was describing how things move from the area around the airport, where it's more of a business district, into the outlying suburban communities and beyond. It was very powerful. Now, none of the characters in Grisham's novel were real. The scenario that unfolded was definitely not real. But the descriptors that he gave about place and setting and customs and culture, many of those are very real and be very familiar to anyone who lived in that part of the country. So centuries from now, if someone picks up Grisham's novel, they might be able to get a little bit of historical information, even from this mythological creation, this fictional creation that Grisham has given birth to. So history and myth, they have always run parallel, and they have often run intertwined as well, and they'll continue to do so probably for the foreseeable future. One can be a key to understanding the other, and knowing the hardness of history and the difficulty of penetrating its mystery sometimes, it makes one appreciate myth all the more for illuminating those parts of the human experience that are a little bit harder to catch, a little bit harder to capture with just raw facts and information.